I want to start my message by telling you a story about a conversation I had with my 5-year-old son, Jude. And whenever you have a conversation with Jude, you get a lot of wisdom to life. He's a deep thinker. He's actually the opposite right now, but he's a special little boy. Well, I picked Jude up from school on Monday, and I always ask Jude, how was the day? And he answers the question the same way all the time. He says it was good because he's a guy. It's fine. That's about all I get out of him. But then I ask him other questions. Well, what did you learn, Jude? Because you go to school to learn. And he usually says, I learned about a letter, or I learned about a number, or I learned about a letter that he thinks is a number, and we clear that up on the way home. But this week, Jude said, today was extra special. We learned about a king. And in our house, we love history, and so I was like, a king, that's great. I said, what was the king's name? And he said, it was King Martin. Now, you're laughing because you're a lot smarter than I am. I didn't figure it out right away. I thought, man, I know about a lot of kings, but certainly I don't know about every king that's ever lived, and maybe there's new things in the history curriculum at our schools. And so I asked him some more questions. I said, well, tell me about King Martin. And he was saying some things that didn't make any sense. And I said, well, did he have any other people around him? Did he have any friends? And Jude said, yeah, he had a friend, this lady. She was very brave because she sat on a bus when she wasn't supposed to. But Dad, it was okay, he said. And I said, wait. Are you talking about Rosa Parks? And he said, yes. And I told him about her biography, which is one of my very favorites I've ever read. And I said, are you talking about Martin Luther King Jr.? And he said, yeah, that's the king, Dad. And I said, well, it's not exactly the king like I was thinking of, but he certainly is worthy of honor. I say that, it just all worked out because the ancient wisdom that we're going to share tonight, and we're in a series where we're teaching ancient wisdom. The wisdom goes all the way back to the Hebrew Bible. Jesus lived it, and it helps us today. Happens to be a piece of wisdom that was the centerpiece of Dr. King's entire ministry and all of the things that he did. The Hebrew phrase is B'Tselem Elohim, which translates into English to the divine image in each person. The Greeks have a version of this. It's called the Imago Dei. And it was the divine image that was inside of every person that was this truth, but also this wisdom that was lived out. And it became the centerpiece of all that Dr. King did. And we honor him tomorrow because of that. It's not just a weekend to go skiing, but it's a weekend to reflect on this wisdom. Here's some of the things that he said. It shows up with the divine image. He said, the brotherhood of man is dependent upon the fatherhood of God. Reject the latter and you erode the foundation of the former. When preparing his people for how they would go out and protest, there were different ways that this was happening in the country at the time. He said, understanding the divine image in all people, he said, it's essential that we have a nonviolent affirmation of the sacredness of human life. We will not be violent. Every conversation about human equity started with the divine image. And he challenged his listeners personally, not just to stand up to those that were oppressors or against injustice, but to look at their own lives. And I wish I could have been in the room when he was preaching. He would preach for hours in the hot southern churches. And you can read and listen to some of his sermons. And I've heard him a couple times as I've listened to some of those old messages. Challenges people who were getting ready to go outside and face their enemies and go outside and advocate for the rights of those that were not being treated like humans, not being treated as created beings, as I'm going to describe to you in a moment. But he would say to them, we cannot be selective in how we apply this wisdom. If there's any hate in our heart, if there's any judgment or prejudice in our heart, we must first deal with that before we can go out and ask for anyone to give us the same. So I love that this became wisdom for him. And wisdom is one of those things that helps us navigate life. And it's actually possible to not feel loving towards someone. It's possible to actually not feel the feelings of respect towards someone, yet to show them the dignity and honor that is due them. Because wisdom is a choice. It is a practice. And as is the case with all wisdom, wisdom shows up the best in the moments of complexity in our lives. When we're in this gray area where things are very, very difficult and we don't know which way to go, God gives us wisdom. He gives us a direction to navigate the difficult things in life. And when we do that, it shines and we see how special it is. So we're after more of that during this series. And tonight we're after more of this wisdom of the divine image in each person. Here's what I want you to hear tonight. You are both an image bearer and meant to be an image restorer. And the divine image is not just something that you are meant to see in other people, but you are meant to see in yourself. Because what happens is usually people fall into one of two categories. They're either the type of person that has a hard time seeing the beauty and virtue and design inside of another person, or they have a hard time seeing the beauty, virtue, and design in themselves. And so this gets to the core of a lot of what it means to be human. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 is where this divine wisdom first appears. And many of you know where we're at. We're in the creation story. God's been speaking. Out of nothing, things are being made. He gets to the sixth day, and then this occurs. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image and in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and over the livestock and all the wild animals and all of the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. In Eugene Peterson's version of the Bible, it's called The Message. It's his paraphrase. He describes it this way. He said, God spoke, let us make human beings in our image, make them reflecting our nature. So God created human beings, and he created them. He uses this strong word, godlike. Not little gods, but godlike, reflecting God's nature. He created them male and female, and then God blessed them. There are a lot of people today that when they get into the book of Genesis, they get hung up on the details and the sequence of events and how literal we're supposed to take it. And so what people try to do is they try to read it like a history book. History books tell us what happened. And some people want to read it like a science book, and science tells us how things happened. But Genesis has a little bit of that, but that's not really the point. Genesis is meant to communicate meaning, deep meaning. So rather than focusing on exactly how all this happened, whether it was a literal 6 days or not, a lot of times people miss the meaning. And the meaning of this passage here in the very beginning is that you and me and every person that has ever been is a creation. Made and fashioned after him. There's a little bit of God in each person. And the wisdom that comes from this truth causes us to think about living in a congruent way to the way God has made each person and sees each person, including ourselves. The divine image is something that we all share in common, regardless of what's happened to you, what you've done, what people have said about you, your race, your sexuality, your age, your gender. It doesn't matter. We all share the divine image in an equal way. The problem is we don't all share the divine wisdom of this divine wisdom of the divine image. Our world is in great need of people who see others just a little bit more the way God sees them. And what happens is this is how we know that we lack it. And I'll be the first to admit I lack this, especially in certain moments. The real test of this wisdom is how do we treat those that we respect less? How about this one? How is it that we treat others that we need less? We're really, really nice and respectful to people that we need, right? How do we treat people that we dislike, admire less? That's the test of this wisdom. And again, it's possible to have feelings of anger and dislike and yet treat a person with dignity, in a just way, and with fairness. So here's what I want us to see tonight as we try to live out more of this wisdom. First, I want us to see the value. I'm going to make a case for the value in each person. I wish we didn't have to do that, but in the world we live in today, we value one another and we value ourselves so little. So first is the value. Second is how this is not just wisdom, but it's meant to be our calling. If you understand that we are meant to live this way, your life will be filled with purpose and meaning no matter what you do or how you spend your time and your days. And number three, I want to talk about practically some things that we need to let go of and also a couple things that we need to do. I'll just do that part really quickly as we close. So let's first start with the value and worth of each person. And I want to show you 3 Hebrew words from the passage that bring this out. So if you go to Genesis 1, 26 and 27, you see this Hebrew word bara, which is the Hebrew word for create. It's there several times to make the point that you are not an accident. It's there several times to make the point that you are, I am, every person that has ever been is the product of a single loving will that designed you and thought of you. Listen to that again. You are the product of a single, creative, loving will. You are also the product of an independent, free, thoughtful personality. God chose to create, and he chose to create you. Now imagine the first creation of man. God is in his new creation having a conversation. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit are there, and they're saying, should we make someone different like us? And they say, let's do it. And I bet they had the conversation, well, if we were to make them with our image and our likeness so that they might relate to us, we have to put freedom in their heart and in their mind. And there's a danger with giving people freedom because they can choose to go the wrong way or another way, but God said, let's do it. And God didn't just create us like he created the animals, remember Adam named each species of animal? But what did God do with each person and each individual? He didn't create a species of humans. He created individual people, and so he gives them names. Adam and Eve. You are unique and special, and you need your own name. Now, that whole thing plays out over and over again. That scene plays out over and over again. Before you were ever made or thought of by your parents, God had a conversation in heaven and said, shall we make some more? And he made people. Individuals, Jen and Derek and Steve and Cheryl. He knew your name. You are a created being. The Father and the Son and the Spirit decided upon you, imagined you, designed you in their head, and fashioned you. And the way they fashioned you was a little different than what happened to Adam. God brought things into being that did not exist, but when it came to the creation of Adam, he took the dust of the ground and he formed the man. But he was not a man yet because the breath of God, through the Spirit of God, needed to be breathed into his lungs, into his spirit, into his soul, into his mind, so that he could be a living, breathing, thinking, loving person. So this is what God does with us. He takes the raw materials not of the dust when he makes us. He takes our parents, and he uses the reproductive system. And he does all of that. He still uses the raw materials that exist in this earth, but then what he does is he breathes into every one of us, into our lungs, and our mind, and our body, and our spirit, and our soul. You are deliberate, a treasure to him. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs describes the uniqueness of humanity this way. He says, we have no fixed essence in being free to do what he or she chooses. We are the one creation that is also creative, the one creation capable of dialogue with the Creator himself and placed in a position of power to steward all that he has made. You were created, you were chosen by God. The scriptures tell us that God chose your time to live. He chose your family. He chose your personality. He chose your gifts and even gave you your gifts. And he even, in some sense, helps set your passions within you. Some of those grow as life goes on, but God set those things within you. We're even told here in the Genesis passage that God chose your gender. And that's why this whole conversation about gender is really disheartening, because a lot of people act like gender doesn't matter. It certainly does. It's a choice of God. He created them male and female. Gender tells a story. This is one of my very favorite messages to give to young adults and college students, is about gender. I get to tell them about how special they are. Your gender has a purpose. If you keep going in the passage, the Hebrew word for make is a little different than this Hebrew word for create. But in other places, this word, asa, shows up as accomplished. So think of it this way. God accomplished you. Americans love to accomplish things. We love to produce. God accomplished you. And not only is he pleased, but he is proud of his accomplishment, because after Eve was created, what did he say about humanity? It is good, and he blessed them. Right after they were created, God spoke that they were good, and he blessed them. Now, understanding this piece of wisdom that each person, including yourself, is a created being, is the beginning of dealing with some things that a lot of people struggle with today. So there are a lot of people that deal with insecurity and self-value. And what we do is we look to other people and we hope that they're going to treat us good enough or love us enough or say the right things. And we go to all the places other than the actual source of security and dignity and love. We look everywhere else. But the beginning of finding your value and being a secure person that can actually stand up in this world and be resilient to the things that happen, but actually give love to others, because that's what secure people are able to do without needing anything in return, starts with understanding what God has done in your life, that he's made you this way, that he sees you this way. This is where your personal value starts. Psalm 139, I think, is one of the moments that David had. He was a guy that struggled with a whole bunch of stuff, including insecurity, but in a moment of clarity, he understood how special he was, at least in God's eyes. Verse 13, Psalm 139, for you created me in my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, and I know them full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body, and all the days ordained for me were written in the book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, and how vast are the sum of them. If you struggle with insecurity, use this verse. Several times a day, return to it. Let God bring some transformation. Ask God to show you what he sees. You are a decision and accomplishment of the highest personality, and so are our enemies. Made with his very nature, and ultimately the reason we were made with his nature is so that we might relate to him. Because that's what God so badly wants. Now there's a couple other words in here that help us understand just how special we are. Let's put them up there. So there's Salem, which is in our phrase, the divine image in all people. And that is the word for image. And then the second word, Demu, is the word for likeness. Now these words sound similar. God didn't put them both in there to kind of say the same thing through two different words, the same thing twice. They actually have different meanings. So the first word for image literally means to look like someone else or to resemble someone. So you were made an outside appearance in the way you behave and act and even the things that you say to look like and mirror back to the world and back to God his very image. So it's like an earthly family and parents with their children. I can remember when our second son, Wyatt, came out. One of the very first things that was said in that delivery room is that he looks just like Brian. And I felt bad for him. Always have. Now, he didn't look just like me, but what people were describing is that he resembled in appearance his father, right? They see my traits in him. You are meant to look like God, to speak, to listen, to relate, to create, to govern, to work as he does. But the second word, likeness, is a little different. It's not to look like, it's to be like. And this is used in other places to describe something that is mannered after something else or modeled after something else. And so if you return to the illustration of parents and their children, this is when we look past the physical resemblance and we see the same traits in children that we see in their parents. And one of the very, very sad things about being a parent is that you begin to notice the bad qualities in yourself being lived out in your children. There's also good, but we're well aware. We're like, oh, great. I've actually learned being married that you never say to your spouse when your kids are behaving badly, you know, that's you and them. Don't you know that? That doesn't go well, all right? Just tips for the single people. We pass on things to our kids. You are to be like him. Loving, gracious, brave, generous, forgiving, faithful. We could go on and on and on about how God is. The seeds of the divine rest in each person. The spark of God is lit inside of every person. In the book, The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis tries to begin to describe this mystery that seems really, really simple, but if you begin to think about it more and more, God's nature and likeness inside of us, it's hard to understand. But here's a couple of things that he says. He says, there are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. And then later on in that same section, he says, next to the blessed sacrament itself, your neighbor is the most holiest object presented to your senses. We don't think that way, do we? Rarely. Sometimes parents think of their kids that way. Every person. Now, there's a paradox here with this idea of the image of God. Maybe you remember Aaron's message last week, and there was a story in there of how kind of brokenness is accepted with the beautiful. But that in that story that Aaron was sharing, the Israelites needed more than an invisible God to worship, even though he had shown himself to them. So they melt down all of their gold and they build a golden calf. They build an image. And there is strong prohibition in the entire Bible against building images of false gods, but there's also prohibition against building images of the one true God. That's why in churches we don't have statues of God. Now, icons are meant to be a different thing. They're meant to be teaching points, but a lot of people don't like icons for that very same reason. But there's this warning, do not try to put God into any form, because he is spirit. And anything that we try to do to kind of capture the essence of God falls short. And so God over and over again says, you can't create an image of me. So God says to us, do not create images of God or himself. But what does he do? He creates little image bearers of himself. There's no need for statues. There's men and women who are meant to bear his image back to the people around them and back to the world and back to God himself. Now, here's another problem that we have. There are a lot of people who do not feel like they are created. They feel small, and they feel lonely, and they feel unseen, undervalued. And all that comes from a number of different places. And part of that is the result of just sin in this world. We have this image of God that's been placed inside of us. And every one of us, because sin is a part of our life and a part of the world, and we're the victims of sin of other people, guess what happens? That image of God that's beautiful that's inside of us is tarnished. And so we live like we're uncreated things with no purpose, and we feel uncreated, undervalued, and we run into people who treat us like we're not created things, and they hurt us, and we do the same to other people all the time because the world is completely corrupted with sin. And you have to understand this, because if you're trying to live out this divine wisdom of seeing the image of God in every person, you will need to hold two things together at once. One is the way God sees them, the way that God created them, and what you actually experience in the person. Because you will see the ugly, and they will hurt you. And there are times that you will be ugly, and you will hurt people, and you will show up in an uncreated way and treat people like they are uncreated. It's a huge problem. But here's what's so amazing about what the scriptures say and what Jesus does. There are two kind of versions of Christianity that kind of battle out over this idea. Some people say that the truest thing about you is that you have sin in your life. And I think that's a really sad place to start. Because the first thing that was ever said about you and me and everyone that we'll ever run into is that they are a created being and that it was good. There's the divine image inside. Now, quickly, sin enters the story, and so that does become part of our understanding of ourselves and other people, but it is not the truest thing. So some people actually believe that sin takes away the image of God inside of you, and it makes a person have zero value. And it's because of that Christians and people of just about every faith have gone out and hurt others in the name of their God, because they see that there's nothing good inside of them. They're not deserving of any respect or dignity or sacrifice or generosity. But the scriptures with Jesus paint a different story. They say, even though you have this divine image that's been tarnished, it's tarnished but not lost. And that's a huge, huge difference. And we're going to see how that connects to our calling in a moment. That it's been tarnished, but it's not lost. The seed is covered. The spark is almost out, but it is still there. Now, this goes to our calling. And, all right, let me say this first about calling. Right now, in our modern world, we are having this important conversation. It's not just in the church, but just our overall culture about calling. And people obsess about finding that one thing in their life that they can give themselves to in their day, that they actually think that they should always get paid for, and that people will always appreciate them for, and that if you find that one thing, which is your calling, then and only then will you have purpose and joy and meaning in your life. Okay? Okay, Nick. The problem with people is that they think that that is the essence of finding meaning in your life, is finding that one specific thing that's unique to you and not to anyone else. Now, that is important. And spending time assessing and reflecting and figuring out what God has gifted you to do and what your passions are, that's all an important part of calling. But that is not the way the scriptures talk about calling. I can't bet money from the stage. I'll just challenge you to find one person in the Bible that lived out a calling that they asked for. They all got crappy jobs that they didn't want. Their calling found them. The stories of them doing amazing things, Daniel, Moses, Mary. Jesus. So here's a better way to think about calling and how this idea of being, understanding the divine image in every person shows up. So I'm going to pull another group of old people into this message. I'm going to pull the Puritans, okay? From the 17th and 18th century. They, in my opinion, write the very best stuff about calling and trying to find your call and where we look for it. And Andy Crouch, who's a modern author, I'm going to use some of his words in the way he describes these three levels of calling that the Puritans have used for a very, very long time. So you can put that slide up there. So there's three levels of calling, and you start at the top. You start with general calling, and then it's highest calling and specific calling. Specific calling was what I was just talking to you about. That's the thing that's specific just to you. Now, general calling is something that every one of us shares, and this is the calling to be image bearers. And this comes from Genesis chapter 1. This is something that every human being that has ever lived contains and is called to do, to bear the image of God. We are here to reflect the Creator into His creation and to reflect the creation's praise and lament back to God. To bear the image and to exercise dominion and creativity and cultivate and steward what God has given us. That is our first calling. Understanding meaning in life starts with that. Now, there is a second calling that comes underneath, and many people refer to this as the highest calling. And this is the calling that is shared by every member of the family of God, and this is to be restorers of the image of God wherever it has been tarnished. And so this includes the covenant family of Israel, that God still is living out a purpose through them, and the church. This is what Crouch says. He says, the entire story of God's people, beginning with Abraham and Sarah, and now extending to all the nations through the reconciling power of the cross, is a vast world historic rescue mission to restore the capacity for true image bearing. In other words, we have a call to help people return to who they are. Our distinct calling as Christians is not just to till and keep the world as image bearers, but to actively seek out the places where the image has been lost. To place ourselves at particular risk on behalf of victims of idolatry and injustice. And so in every workplace, Christians should be those who speak up most quickly and sacrifice their privileges more readily for those whose image bearing has been compromised by the organization's patterns of neglect. In every society, Christians should be the most active in using their talents on behalf of those society considers marginal or unworthy. In every place, also, look what it says, where the gospel isn't known, Christians should be finding ways to proclaim Jesus as the Lord's true Lord, the image of the invisible God. Ephesians 2, you were created in Christ Jesus to do good works. You are His workmanship, we're told. This is our highest calling. And I want you to notice that the work of justice and proclaiming Jesus go together. They're always meant to go that way. Now, if you understand general calling and highest calling, and you spend the majority of your effort and your time living out those two things, guess what happens? The third one kind of takes care of itself. You will not come home if you've been living out your general calling of an image bearer and your highest calling of an image restorer. You will not come home and say, that was a worthless day. I'm wasting my life. You will never say that. Now, you might say, I don't like my job, or I need to make a change. But you're not looking for that specific thing to give you your meaning and purpose because you found it in your first two callings. By the way, if you skip the general calling and go right to highest calling, you'll be someone who tries to bring the good news, but it will show up as bad news. And you'll be a person that will be so nicked by the world that you will have a hard time showing up and sacrificing yourself for others. They're meant to go in this order. That's your calling, to see the divine image in all people, to be image bearers, image restorers. All right, let me begin to wrap up here. And I want to just make it practical. I want us to think very specific about our own lives and be honest with ourselves. So I'm going to tell you a story. And this is meant to give us some courage to let go of some things in us that are not very pretty. This is part of the tarnished image of God in each one of us that we need to let go of so that we can be image restorers for others. And some of this has to do with letting go of stereotypes and judgments and prejudice and racism, all those things, okay? And we have more of it than we think we do. Even though we're such sophisticated people, our world is so nice, isn't it? We're so advanced. No, we're so far behind. So when I was a kid, I grew up in a small mountain town in Colorado, and it was a very different culture than we have here in Boulder. And in my town, it was made up of primarily Latino and Hispanic families, and many actual Mexican families that were living there for part of the year, working in the farm fields that were near my town. And in every class that I was ever in every grade, and every team that I was ever on, I was well aware that my type, a white person, was less common than the other type. And so I was well aware that I was a minority in my culture. I was also aware, though, that I was living in a majority culture. So I wasn't a minority in our overall culture, but in my little town I was. And that's just a unique experience that any minority could ever tell you about. And so I just had it for about 18 years. Those are the years I lived there. And because of that, my brothers and I were often called names and mistreated and targeted for different things because we just looked different from everyone else. And in my town, there wasn't a lot of business and there wasn't a lot of money, and most of the people that lived in our community were really poor. And we stood out because my dad had us right in the middle of the middle class because he had a successful small business, and so we were also often called the rich boys and mistreated because of that. Now, the good thing is, I'm not a very sensitive person, so it did bother me from time to time, but usually it wouldn't bother me. But after a while, when you were seen different and excluded from things, it got to you. And one thing that actually just helped my brothers and I survive the little town that we grew up in, because it was really rough, is we were tough. And we could defend ourselves. And we often had to. And we're often in the principal's office because we were targeted for different things. Now, I don't say that to tell you that I was a victim, but I'd say that to make this point. Because of that experience, and by the way, there was also a lot of good things about that culture and my friends and that community. But because of that experience, over those 18 years, I had some settled stereotypes and beliefs and prejudice against people from that community. And I wasn't aware of it completely. And so I go away to college, and at college you kind of get to pick your community, and I was living in something that seemed very, very different. And then right after college, I took a job here at Cornerstone 17 years ago, and I don't have to tell you, but Boulder is very, very different than my little community. And the first year that I was here, my first job was doing student ministry, and I wanted to spend some time in the schools, and so I offered to be a coach, and I tried to get a job coaching different places, and the only school that was needing a football and a wrestling coach at the time was Casey Middle School. And some of you know where Casey's at. Casey's up just north of Pearl Street in a beautiful part of the city, and it's now this amazing, beautiful building. But at the time that I started teaching there, it was a very different school. It was the oldest building in the district, and almost all of the city of Boulder's ESL, and many of these kids were living under the poverty line, all of those kids were bused to Casey. And so many people just knew it as the Spanish-speaking school. And it actually became a shame of the school district that all of these kids were in the crappiest building, and none of the neighborhood kids were going to that school. So it was known as the rough school. When I interviewed for the job as a coach, I was told that they hadn't had a team in 5 or 10 years. There hadn't been a coach that had showed up and tried to teach the boys just about the importance of playing sports, and there wasn't anyone there to keep the team together because eligibility and fighting, because half the team was in a gang, was a problem, and so they had just given up, and no one was there to give those boys a chance. And the athletic director had some vision. He said, we got to get it going again, but it's going to be a challenge. And so I took the jobs. And that first year, and really it was more than that first year, those first 2 years, a couple times, certain prejudice and ugliness inside of me kind of peaked up. My boys would be doing things and I would react because I'm thinking, I've been around this before and I don't dislike it. I was coaching the very kids that I had gone to school with. That's what it seemed like. Now, what had happened, and this is what I'm grateful for, over those years from high school to the time that I became a coach, I had really grown in the Lord, and I had been discipled, and I had learned that the gospel is not just something that we receive and we wear in our life, but it's something that we see the world through. We see it through grace. And this wisdom is part of living the gospel life. And so I knew that there wasn't any room for me as a follower of Jesus or someone who wants to honor God to have these things in my heart and to respond that way. And so little by little, I began to ask God for transformation in this area of my life. But it was a surprise. I had no idea that I had carried that from my little town, Monte Vista, to Greeley and now to Boulder. I had no idea that it was there, but it was. And I needed to let God work in my life and bring some transformation, which he did. What happened is, over the next 10 years, I became one of the strongest advocates for those kids in our community. The first year we had a wrestling team. None of my kids could afford to buy wrestling shoes. Not one. And, I'm kind of prideful about wrestling. I'm like, you can't wrestle in socks or your street shoes. You're going to look silly. You guys need wrestling shoes. And so I went to a really wealthy businessman in our community that loves wrestling, and I told him the story about these boys, and I said, let's respect them. No one else is giving them this value. Most people think they're not going to stick it out. Let's get them some shoes, and he paid for the shoes. For years, they had a hard time getting coaches. I found almost all of my coaches for 10 years from people sitting right here. College athletes, men that were at the University of Colorado studying engineering, getting PhD degrees, they came and were around the boys because you know what we thought? They deserved the best. The Lord had worked in a special way. I had to let go of some of those things. I'll tell you this also. At the same time, I was a victim of the very thing that I was showing up with those boys at the very same time. So we were doing this work I was telling you about with the schools and with the school district. And it was exciting because for the years before, it wasn't just me getting here, but in the years before I had arrived, the school district had kind of drawn some lines in the sand and said, we don't want anyone from the church community to be around our schools. In fact, there was a document that was passed around to all the ministries and all the churches saying, you can't be on campus of conducting business. And they defined conducting business, building a relationship with a kid. And so we were actually making some progress because we had been serving the schools. And so it was several superintendents ago, but we were with him and we were with his deputy superintendents. And he said, you guys care so much about us. You're serving us. How is it that we can have you come around kids and support families and students more often? And we said, this is fantastic. And we were putting together a plan. And none of the plan included us passing out Jesus loves you pencils or breaking the law. We just wanted to be there for kids and their families. And someone, and I won't mention this because I don't want to look bad on our district because they're a partner of ours. There's just certain people like this everywhere. There was someone in a position of power within the school district that found out a bunch of Christians wanted to be around kids and began to say things like, it can't happen. They are not safe. That's an actual phrase that got back to me at that time. They are not safe. And I felt very, very misunderstood and like someone was seeing me not as a created being at that time. Now, what I wanted to do is what most of us want to do. I wanted to spend my energy going after that person. But I can't control them. But what I could control, what was happening with me and my boys over at the school. We live on both sides of this. We're givers of this, and we're receivers of it, the good and the bad. Today, because of many of you in this room, our district doesn't see us the way they did then. Because we kept showing up. We were there to see the people that weren't being seen. Those that didn't feel created, we said that you are. And now we're partners together and get to do some really neat work. So that's one of those things we have to let go of. Our prejudice. And you know what's happening right now in our culture? Because there's a culture war going on and it's disguised as a political war. But it's really a culture war. Once again, all of our judgments and superiorities being exposed again. It's being shown for what it is. This attitude that we are better than someone else because they disagree with us, or we're better than someone else because they stand for the things that we don't stand for. There's nothing wrong for standing for things. But we have this tarnished part of ourselves that keeps us from being image bearers and image redeemers the way that we're meant to be. By the way, your primary calling is not to support a political party. This is one of the problems right now that's happening within the church. We think the primary way to change the world is how we vote. The primary way you change the world is to live out your calling as an image bearer and an image redeemer wherever you go. And there is room to participate in our system, but that is not your highest calling. All right, a couple other things as I close. Worship team, you guys can come out. I just want to mention them quick. I think most people understand these. B'Tselem, Elohim, the divine image in all people, living out this wisdom. If you understand this, you'll be dedicated to two things. First of all, you'll be dedicated to justice. Wherever, whenever, anyone is undervalued, treated badly, not noticed, not seen, not cared for, not given a chance, guess what happens? Because of Jesus, you move towards them. Not necessarily with the answers to solve all of the problems, but you understand that you have something that you can bring. Here's one of the problems right now, too, when it comes to justice. We think that it's our job to handle everything, every issue of injustice. No. There's a big team here. And God has a church in just about every community in the world that's meant to show up and bring justice. And it's not just the church that does this. There are others outside of our faith that cares about the same things. But find your place. We should have an insatiable appetite to see more things the way God does, more people the way God does, treated the way God wants them treated. One of our favorite verses here talks about acting and seeking justice and mercy. You don't just wait for it to knock on your door. And in Boulder County, you might wait a long time. But you seek it. And then you show up and you do the things that Jesus would do, and you care for people and you help them see that they are created as you live as a created being. And here's the other thing we do, and I mentioned it earlier, but we need to be people who continue to share our faith. And this is important to me because as a church in our community, we're really, really known for our justice work, which is amazing. That's what we do want to be known for, that we serve and that we partner. I want to make sure that as we're doing that, as a faith community, we don't stop sharing what God has done in our own lives. Now, there's a big, ugly word that a lot of Christians don't like today. It's called evangelism. It scares them. And the reason some people don't like it is because you've experienced evangelism from someone else in a negative way. And it's amazing how certain people can turn the good news into really, really crappy news. And you don't want to do that. And so you just don't say anything. That's an equal mistake. Because if you think about the tarnished image, divine image inside of every one of us, there is only one person who has been through a grave and out the other side. There is only one person that has the power of resurrection, and it's Jesus. And there is only one person that breathes the Spirit into that spark and that seed inside of people that reanimates and grows and fuels the image of God inside of them. You will deny people being image bearers as new creation. It's not a coincidence that we're referred to as new creation when we are born again, because it needs recreated. Every person needs it. And if you're going to be an image bearer and an image redeemer, you need to help people bear the image of God as much as they can. And so spend your time trying to do it wisely rather than just saying, I'm not going to do it at all. They are meant to be siblings, twins that work together. I don't know a better group in the city of Boulder to be talking about their faith than Cornerstone, because you are so generous and active in the community. You are the best to do it. So let's let go of the judgment and the prejudice. Let's seek justice. And when the Lord gives us an opportunity, as Paul described in Colossians, may we take advantage of every opportunity to speak the truth of God. All right, let's pray. Father, thank you for tonight, and thank you for this message that it really is pretty simple, but it's really hard for us to live out. So first of all, I pray, God, for just a real sense, a true sense of love and value for every person in this room. I pray that they would hear the voice of the Father whispering to them through the Spirit, affirmation and love and value and dignity. May we have full hearts. May we see ourselves as you do. And then out of that, God, I pray that we would begin to see others that way. And not just see others that way, but we would begin to move with wisdom in treating others this way. And we'd begin to live out our call more and more to be not only image bearers, but image redeemers. Father, I just bless this week. There'll be people who leave this here and go out into their life this week, and they have the opportunity to redeem the image of God in someone or in some place. We bless those efforts. Give them wisdom and power to do so, courage to show up. We bless that in Jesus' name. And Father, I also just want to give anyone a chance that has been far from God. Maybe they've journeyed through life apart from you their whole life for a long time. We just want to make it some time tonight, Lord, where they can ask you to re-enter their life. You tell us that if we just open the door, you'll come in to be with us. That we were made to know you and fellowship with you, connect with you. I pray that you would do that. So through faith, Father, I pray that those that have been far from you would come to you in a humble way, confessing their sins, receiving forgiveness, and beginning this new journey with you, Jesus. Speak to them so that they might open their hearts. And Father, for any person that did that tonight, we bless the beginning of their journey. We pray that the scriptures would be life to them, that the Spirit would speak to them, and that your family, the family of God, would show off Jesus to them. So bless that journey. Thank you for tonight, Lord. Help us live out more and more of this wisdom as a community here at Cornerstone. We love you and pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, let's stand together, and these guys are going to take us out.